The desert sun hung merciless and white in the August sky when Brennan heard the crying. A sound so faint and desperate that at first he thought it might be the wind playing tricks across the barren stretch between Rico, Colorado, and the next trading post. It was 1882, and the high desert country didn't forgive mistakes or show mercy to the unprepared, which made the thin wail of an infant all the more impossible, all the more urgent. Lucas pulled his horse to a stop, leather creaking in the stillness, and listened hard past the blood rushing in his ears. There it was again. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting packed earth that shimmered with heat, and followed the sound to a cluster of rocks about 50 yards off the trail. What he found there drove the breath clean out of his lungs. A baby, no more than a few months old by the look of it, lay wrapped in a thin cotton blanket that had once been white but now bore the rust-colored stains of the land itself. The child's face was red from crying and exposure, tiny fists waving at the empty sky. Lucas dropped to his knees beside the infant, his hands hovering uncertainly before he scooped the baby up with the careful reverence of a man handling something both precious and terrifying. The baby was a girl, he could see now, with wisps of dark hair plastered to her scalp with sweat. She couldn't have been out here long, maybe an hour or two, but in this heat that was long enough. Who would abandon you? The words came out rough, catching in his throat. Lucas looked around at the emptiness, at the scrub brush and distant mountains, searching for any sign of who might have left this child to die. Nothing. No tracks, no wagon ruts, no indication of why or how or who, just a baby and the indifferent desert and a question that had no good answer. The infant's cries had quieted to whimpers now that she was being held, and Lucas felt something crack open in his chest that he'd thought sealed tight years ago. He'd been riding alone for so long, keeping to himself, keeping people at arm's length after everything that had happened in Texas. But this wasn't something a man could walk away from, not if he wanted to keep calling himself human. He carried the baby back to his horse, murmuring nonsense words of comfort, and dug through his saddlebags for his canteen. The baby was surely dehydrated, but he knew enough to know you couldn't just pour water down an infant's throat. He dampened his bandana and let the baby suck on the wet cloth, her tiny mouth working desperately at the moisture. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until he could get to Rico. The town was still another 8 miles west, and Lucas made the ride in half the usual time, keeping the baby cradled against his chest with one arm while the other worked the reins. She'd stopped crying entirely now, which worried him more than the wailing had. Too quiet meant too tired, maybe slipping toward something worse. Rico came into view as the sun began its descent toward the peaks, the small collection of buildings huddled in a valley where silver mines had brought fortune seekers and those who fed off them. It wasn't much of a town, maybe 200 souls on a good day, but it had a doctor and a general store and a saloon where miners drank away their earnings. More importantly, it had women who would know what to do with a baby better than a 32-year-old drifter who'd spent the last decade avoiding any kind of attachment. Lucas rode straight down the main street, ignoring the curious looks, and pulled up in front of the building that served as both doctor's office and apothecary. He dismounted carefully, the baby stirring against him, and shouldered through the door without bothering to knock. "Doctor." Harlan Mathers looked up from the medicinal herbs he'd been sorting, his weathered face showing surprise and then concern as he saw what Lucas carried. "Good God, is that a baby? Found her out in the desert, maybe 10 miles east," Lucas said. "Alone in the dust like someone just set her down and walked away. She needs water, food, whatever babies need. I don't know the first thing about this." The doctor was already moving, clearing space on his examination table, his hands already reaching. "Set her down here, gentle now." How long was she out there? Can't say for certain. Hour or two, maybe more. Lucas laid the infant down, his hands reluctant to let go now that he'd held her this long. No sign of anybody around, no tracks, nothing. "Doctor." Mathers worked quickly, unwrapping the soiled blanket, checking the baby over with practiced efficiency. "She's dehydrated but not critical. Lucky you found her when you did. Another few hours and we'd be having a different conversation." He glanced up at Lucas. "You have any idea whose child this is?" "Not a clue. Like I said, she was just there, abandoned." The word tasted bitter. "What kind of person does that to a baby? Desperate one, I'd wager, or cruel. Hard to say which is worse." The doctor had retrieved a glass bottle with a rubber nipple and was filling it with water mixed with a small amount of sugar. "Here, you hold her and feed her this. Slow now. Let her drink at her own pace." Lucas took the baby back into his arms, settling into the chair the doctor indicated, and offered the bottle. The infant latched on with fierce determination, her small hands coming up to grip the glass. He watched her drink, this tiny creature who'd been cast aside, and felt that crack in his chest widen into something that might have been purpose. "She'll need milk soon, proper nutrition," Dr. Mathers said. "And someone to care for her. You planning on taking that responsibility?" The question hung in the air between them. Lucas had no home to speak of, just a string of jobs moving cattle or guarding shipments, always moving, never settling. A baby didn't fit into that life, not even close. But the alternative was leaving her to the uncertain mercy of an orphanage or whoever might claim her, and something in him rebelled against that with surprising violence. "I'll figure something out," he said, which wasn't an answer but was all he had. Dr. Mathers nodded slowly. "Well, for tonight she needs a place to sleep and someone to watch her. There's a boarding house at the end of the street, run by Willa Fletcher. She might be able to help, and she'll know more about babies than either of us combined." The name meant nothing to Lucas, but he filed it away. The baby had finished most of the bottle and was looking drowsy, her eyelids drooping. He stood carefully, afraid to jostle her, and reached for his coin purse. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing for this. But you'll need supplies. Diapers, proper milk if you can get it, clothes. The general store might have some of what you need." Lucas thanked him and stepped back out into the fading light. The street had filled with the evening crowd, miners finished with their shifts and looking for entertainment, women in faded calico making their way home from various shops. He felt conspicuous standing there with an infant in his arms, like he was wearing a sign that said he had no idea what he was doing. The general store yielded some cotton cloth that could be fashioned into diapers, and a small blanket that wasn't full of desert dust. The proprietor, an older woman with kind eyes, threw in a small tin of talcum powder and some advice about keeping the baby clean and dry. Lucas paid and tried to remember everything she'd said, knowing he'd probably forget half of it by the time he needed it. The boarding house was a two-story structure that looked like it had seen better days, but was well maintained despite its age. A wooden sign out front declared it Fletcher's rooms and board in painted letters that were only slightly faded. Lucas climbed the steps to the wide porch and knocked on the door frame, since the door itself stood open to catch the evening breeze. "Come in," a woman's voice called from somewhere inside. He stepped into a front parlor that was clean and simply furnished, braided rugs on the floor and lace curtains at the windows. The woman who emerged from what looked like a dining room was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said what he'd been expecting. She was young, maybe 26 or 27, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes the color of honey in sunlight. She wore a simple dress in pale blue, and there was flour dusted on her hands like she'd been interrupted in the middle of baking. She stopped when she saw him, her gaze dropping to the baby in his arms, and surprise flickered across her features. "Can I help you? Dr. Mathers sent me. Said you might be able to help with the baby. I'm Lucas Brennan, and this little one, I found her abandoned out in the desert this afternoon." The words came out in a rush, and he forced himself to slow down. "I need a room, and I need help figuring out how to take care of her, at least until I can sort out what to do." Willa Fletcher moved closer, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she looked at the infant. "Abandoned? Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. She was alone, no one around for miles, just left there in the heat to die." Something hardened in Willa's eyes, a flash of anger quickly controlled. "Well, she's safe now, and that's what matters." She reached out, her hands hovering in question, and Lucas found himself passing the baby over without hesitation. Willa cradled the infant with the ease of someone who'd done this before, her whole demeanor softening. "Poor little darling. You've had a terrible day, haven't you?" The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry but close, and Willa began to sway gently, an automatic motion. "I have a room available, Mr. Brennan. First floor, which will be easier with a baby, and I can help with her care, at least for now. I have some experience with infants." Relief washed through Lucas with unexpected force. "I'd appreciate that more than I can say, Miss Fletcher. I'll pay extra for the trouble." "Mrs. Fletcher," she corrected gently. "I'm a widow, and it's no trouble not for something like this." She looked up from the baby to meet his eyes. "What you did, bringing her to safety, that took a good heart. Not every man would have stopped." Lucas felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "Couldn't leave her. Wouldn't be right." "No, it wouldn't." Willa smiled, and it transformed her face from pretty to something that made his heart kick against his ribs. "Come on, I'll show you the room, and then we'll get this little one cleaned up and fed properly." "What's her name?" "Don't know. There was nothing with her, no note, no identification." "Then we'll have to call her something, at least for now." Willa led the way down a hall to a room at the back of the house, still swaying gently with the baby. "What about Hope? Seems fitting given how you found her." Lucas tested the name silently. Hope. It felt presumptuous somehow, naming something that wasn't his, but the alternative was just calling her the baby indefinitely. "Hope works." The room was small but clean, with a single bed covered in a quilt, a dresser, and a washstand. A window looked out onto a small garden where vegetables grew in neat rows. It was more homey than anywhere Lucas had stayed in recent memory, which probably said more about his life than the room itself. "I'll bring in a basket for Hope to sleep in," Willa said. "It's not a proper cradle, but it'll do until something better can be arranged. Now, let me show you how to change a diaper, because you're going to need to know." The next hour was an education Lucas had never expected to receive. Willa was patient and thorough, showing him how to clean the baby, how to fold cloth into makeshift diapers, how to check if she was too hot or too cold. She sent him to the kitchen to heat water while she got Hope cleaned up, and when he returned, the baby was wrapped in a fresh blanket and looking considerably more comfortable. "She needs milk," Willa said. "Real milk, not just sugar water. I have some fresh from this morning." "It's not mother's milk, but it will have to do." She prepared another bottle while Lucas held Hope, who seemed content now to simply stare up at him with dark, unfocused eyes. "You said you found her this afternoon. No sign of anyone around. Nothing." "It's like someone just appeared, put her down, and vanished." Lucas shook his head. "I keep trying to make sense of it, but there's no sense to be made. Maybe someone desperate. Maybe someone who thought this was the only choice." Willa handed him the bottle, watching as he offered it to Hope. "Or maybe someone cruel who didn't want to be burdened. We'll probably never know. Does it matter? Either way, she deserves better. She does. Willa settled into the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap. What are you planning to do, Mr. Brennan? You can't exactly drift from town to town with an infant. It was the question that had been circling in his mind since he'd found Hope. I don't know yet. First thing is to ask around, see if anyone knows anything about a missing baby or a woman who might have given birth recently. Maybe there's family somewhere. And if there isn't, Lucas looked down at the baby in his arms, at her tiny, perfect fingers curled around the bottle. Then I'll figure something out. She's not going to an orphanage if I can help it. Something in Willa's expression shifted, a warmth entering her eyes that hadn't been there before. That's good of you. Most men would hand her over to the first institution and ride away. I'm not most men. I'm beginning to see that. They sat in comfortable silence while Hope finished her bottle, and Lucas found himself studying Willa Fletcher when she wasn't looking. She had a quiet competence about her, a capability that suggested she was used to handling whatever life threw at her without complaint. There were small lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of smiling, but also a sadness underneath that he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. Loss left a mark. How long have you been widowed? The question was out before he could think better of it, and he winced. Sorry, that's not my business. It's all right. Willa's smile was sad but not bitter. 3 years now. My husband Thomas died in a mining accident. He was a good man, just unlucky. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. It's been long enough that the sharp edges have worn smooth mostly. I keep busy with the boarding house, and that helps. She stood, brushing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. I should let you get settled. I'll bring that basket for Hope, and if you need anything during the night, my room is upstairs at the front of the house. Don't hesitate to knock if she starts crying and you can't calm her. Lucas thanked her, and she slipped out with the kind of quiet grace that suggested she was used to moving through the world without making a fuss. He looked around the room, at his saddlebags in the corner and the baby in his arms, and wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. That night was the longest Lucas could remember. Hope woke 3 times, crying with the desperate urgency of an infant who couldn't communicate except through tears. Each time, Lucas fumbled in the dark, trying to remember everything Willa had taught him, checking if Hope needed changing or feeding or just comfort. By the 3rd time, he was exhausted and feeling completely out of his depth. He was pacing the room, Hope against his shoulder, when a soft knock came at the door. Willa stood in the hallway in a wrapper, her hair loose around her shoulders, a lamp in her hand. I heard her crying. Do you need help? Pride warred with desperation, and desperation won. I don't know what she wants. I've fed her, changed her, tried everything. Willa came in, setting the lamp on the dresser, and held out her arms. Lucas passed Hope over gratefully. Willa held the baby close, swaying and humming something low and wordless. After a few minutes, Hope's cries subsided to whimpers and then to silence. Her eyes closed, tiny body relaxing into sleep. Sometimes they just need to be held, Willa whispered. Sometimes that's all any of us need. She laid Hope carefully in the basket she'd brought earlier, tucking the blanket around her. In the lamplight, Willa looked younger, softer, and Lucas felt something stir that he'd thought he'd left behind in Texas along with everything else. Thank you, he said quietly. I would have been up all night. You might be anyway. Babies are unpredictable. She picked up her lamp, then hesitated. You're doing fine, Mr. Brennan, better than fine. She's lucky you found her. Lucas, call me Lucas. Then you should call me Willa. She smiled, and even in the dim light he could see the warmth in it. Try to get some sleep, Lucas. Tomorrow we can start asking around, see if anyone knows anything. She left him there in the quiet room with a sleeping baby and a heart that felt less guarded than it had in years. Lucas lay down on the bed fully clothed, close enough to the basket that he'd wake if Hope so much as stirred and closed his eyes. Sleep came eventually, thin and restless, but it came. Morning arrived with sunlight through the window and Hope's hungry cries. Lucas changed her diaper with only moderate fumbling and carried her out to the kitchen, following the smell of coffee and bacon. Willa was at the stove, already dressed for the day, and she turned with a smile when she heard him. "Good morning. How did the rest of the night go?" "Better after you worked your magic." Lucas accepted the cup of coffee she poured him, balancing Hope in one arm. "She slept until about an hour ago. That's good. She's recovering from yesterday." Willa prepared a bottle and gestured to the table. "Sit, feed her, and I'll fix you breakfast. Then we should talk to Sheriff Dalton. Let him know what happened." The sheriff's office was a small building near the center of town, and Sheriff Tom Dalton was a solid man in his 50s with a badge that had seen better days and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Lucas's story without interrupting, occasionally glancing at Hope where she dozed in Willa's arms. "That's a strange business," Dalton said when Lucas finished. "Can't say I've heard of anyone around here expecting a baby or recently having one. But I'll ask around, send some wires to the surrounding towns. Maybe someone knows something." "I'd appreciate that." Lucas shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the scrutiny. "What happens if no one claims her, legally? She'd be considered abandoned property, though I hate calling a baby that. You found her, so you have as much claim as anyone until a parent or relative comes forward. If no one does, she'd go to an orphanage in Denver, most likely." "That's not happening." The words came out harder than Lucas intended. "There has to be another option." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "You planning on keeping her? You got a wife, a home, the means to raise a child." "Not yet, but I'll figure it out." "He's not alone in this," Willa said quietly, speaking up for the first time. "I'm helping with Hope's care, and I'm willing to continue doing so for as long as needed." The sheriff looked between them, something calculating in his expression. "Well, that's real charitable of you, Mrs. Fletcher, but the law's going to want something more official if this goes on more than a few days. You might need to think about guardianship papers, that sort of thing." They thanked him and left, stepping back out into the bright morning. Lucas felt the weight of reality settling on his shoulders. He had maybe $100 to his name, no permanent employment, and no idea what came next. But he looked at Hope, sleeping peacefully now, and couldn't imagine just walking away. "He's right, you know," Willa said as they walked back toward the boarding house. "If you're serious about this, you'll need stability. A job, a home, something to show you can provide for her. I know. I'm not foolish enough to think this is simple." Lucas stopped walking, turning to face her. "But I meant what I said. She deserves better than being shuttled off to an orphanage. Then we'll make sure she gets better." Willa met his gaze steadily. "I meant what I said too. I'll help." "Why?" "You don't know me, don't know anything about me except that I brought you a foundling and a problem." Willa was quiet for a moment, looking down at Hope. "Because I know what it's like to feel abandoned. When Thomas died, I had no family, no one to turn to. This town took me in, helped me get the boarding house started, gave me a chance to build something. Maybe it's my turn to do the same for someone else. And besides..." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I see the way you look at her. That's not obligation. That's love starting to take root, whether you know it or not." Lucas had no answer to that, because she was right and he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Lucas spent his mornings asking around town, trying to find any information about Hope's origins, while Willa cared for the baby and ran her boarding house. Afternoons, he'd return and Willa would teach him more about infant care, patient and thorough. Evenings, they'd sit on the porch while Hope slept nearby, talking about nothing and everything. He learned that Willa had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a farmer who'd lost everything to debt and drink. She'd married Thomas Fletcher when she was 19, and they'd come west looking for a better life. The mining had been good for a while, good enough that they'd bought the house and started the boarding business. Then Thomas had gone down in the mine one day and hadn't come back up. She'd been 24 and alone, but she'd refused to give up or give in. Lucas told her about Texas, though he left out the worst parts. About the ranch he'd worked and the foreman who'd run it into the ground through corruption and cruelty. About standing up for what was right and paying for it with his reputation and nearly his life. About deciding that drifting was easier than putting down roots that could be torn up. "That sounds lonely," Willa said one evening, rocking Hope gently. "It was. Is." Lucas looked out at the darkening sky. "But it also seemed safer. Can't lose what you don't have. Can't gain it either." He had no argument for that truth. On the fourth day, Sheriff Dalton came by with news. No one in any of the surrounding towns had reported a missing baby. No one knew of any women who'd been pregnant and suddenly weren't. It was like hope had materialized from thin air, which they all knew wasn't possible but couldn't explain otherwise. "I'll keep the inquiries open," Dalton said. "But I'll be honest with you, Lucas. The longer this goes without someone coming forward, the less likely it is that anyone will. You need to start thinking about next steps." Lucas knew he was right. That night, after Hope was asleep and the boarding house was quiet, he sat at the small desk in his room and tried to figure out his finances. He had enough money to cover his room and board for maybe another month, 2 if he stretched it. After that, he'd need work. The problem was that most work available to a man like him involved moving around, following cattle drives or guard jobs or whatever else came up. None of that was compatible with caring for an infant. A knock on the door interrupted his calculations. Willa stood in the hallway, still dressed but looking tired. "Can we talk?" "Of course." He stood, gesturing her in, suddenly aware of how small the room was with both of them in it. Willa didn't sit, instead clasping her hands in front of her like she was nervous. "I've been thinking about your situation, about Hope's situation, and I have an idea. You don't have to answer right away, and you can say no without any hard feelings. All right. Stay here, not just as a boarder but as help. The boarding house does well enough, but I could use someone to handle repairs, manage supplies, deal with difficult guests. It wouldn't pay much in money, but room and board would be covered and you'd be here with Hope. She could stay here too. I have space and I'm already helping with her care anyway." Lucas stared at her, trying to process the offer. "Willa, that's incredibly generous, but I can't ask you to take on that burden. You're not asking, I'm offering." She met his eyes. "And it's not entirely selfless. I do need help, and having you here would make my life easier, not harder, but more than that." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I like having you both here. The house feels less empty, and Hope needs stability, needs people who care about her. We can give her that." "We," Lucas repeated softly. "You make it sound like we're in this together." "Aren't we? Haven't we been these past few days?" She was right, he realized. They'd been functioning as a team, sharing the responsibility for Hope without even discussing it. It had felt natural, felt right in a way few things in his life had. "Yes," he said. "Yes to your offer, and yes, we're in this together. And thank you, Willa. This means more than I can say." She smiled, the tension leaving her shoulders. "Good. We can work out the details tomorrow, but I wanted you to know you have options. You're not alone in this." That word again. Alone. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what the alternative felt like. Now, standing in this small room with this woman who'd shown him more kindness than he probably deserved, with a baby sleeping in a basket nearby, he remembered. It felt like coming home after years of wandering. The weeks that followed were the busiest and most content of Lucas's recent memory. He threw himself into work around the boarding house, fixing the sagging porch railing and replacing shingles on the roof, repairing the fence around Willa's garden, and building a proper shed for storing firewood. The work was satisfying in a way that his previous jobs hadn't been, maybe because he was building something rather than just passing through. Hope thrived under their combined care. She gained weight. Her cries became less desperate and more demanding, and she started to do the things babies did, like grasping at fingers and making sounds that weren't quite words but weren't quite random either. Willa showed Lucas how to make her laugh, how to soothe her when she was fussy, how to read her needs before she got to the point of crying. They fell into an easy partnership that felt like it had existed much longer than it had. Mornings, Lucas would wake early and start the fires, then take Hope so Willa could prepare breakfast for the handful of boarders. During the day, they'd trade off, one handling Hope while the other worked. Evenings were for sitting together, talking while Hope played on a blanket between them or slept in the basket that had become her bed. It would have been easy to let it stay like that, comfortable and safe and undefined. But somewhere in the third week, Lucas realized that what he felt for Willa had shifted from gratitude and respect into something deeper, something that made his heart speed up when she smiled at him and made him aware of every accidental touch. He caught her watching him sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, a softness in her expression that made him hope he wasn't alone in what he was feeling. One evening in late September, after Hope had been put to bed and the house was quiet, Lucas found Willa in the garden, checking on the last of the season's vegetables. The air had taken on the crisp edge of autumn, and she'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "Need help?" he asked, stepping out onto the porch. "Nearly done. The frost will come soon, and that'll be the end of the tomatoes." She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Though I did get a good harvest this year, we'll have plenty of preserves for winter." Lucas came down the steps, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't want to resist anymore. "Willa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever think about the future, about what comes next?" She tilted her head, studying him. "I think about it constantly." "What do you mean specifically?" "I mean us. You and me and Hope, what we're building here." He took a breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of something important. "It feels like more than just convenience or charity. It feels like family." "It does," she said softly. "It feels exactly like that. I need you to know that I care about you, Willa. Not just because you've helped with Hope, not just because you've given us a place to stay. I care about you because you're kind and strong and beautiful, and spending time with you has become the best part of my days." The words came easier than he'd expected, maybe because they were true. "I know it's fast, and I know I don't have much to offer, but I wanted you to know." Willa closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his face with her dirt-smudged hand. "Lucas Brennan, you have more to offer than you know, and you're not alone in what you're feeling. I've been half in love with you since you walked through my door with that baby and looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world." "Only half." He was smiling, couldn't help it. "Maybe more than half." She was smiling too. "Maybe all the way." Lucas kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. She kissed him back with a sweetness that made his chest ache, her hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. When they parted, both were breathing harder, and the space between them felt charged with possibility. "So what do we do now?" Willa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we keep doing what we've been doing, but we do it as a couple. As partners in everything, not just taking care of Hope." Lucas took her hands in his. "And when enough time has passed that it won't be scandalous, I'd like to marry you if you'll have me." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." They stood there in the garden as the stars came out, holding each other and making quiet plans for a future that had seemed impossible just a few weeks ago. Lucas thought about the moment he'd heard Hope crying in the desert, how close he'd come to riding past, dismissing the sound as wind or imagination. How different his life would be now if he had. It felt like providence, like something bigger than chance had been at work. The proposal to make things official came sooner than Lucas had planned, prompted by a visit from the sheriff 2 weeks later. Dalton came to the boarding house with papers in hand and a serious expression that made Lucas's stomach tighten. "I got a response to one of my inquiries," Dalton said, sitting at Willa's kitchen table. "There's a woman in Durango says she might have information about the baby." Lucas felt his world tilt. What kind of information? Wouldn't say exactly, just that she wants to meet with whoever found the child. Could be the mother, could be a relative, could be nothing. But I thought you should know. "When?" Willa asked, her hand finding Lucas's under the table. "She's asking for a meeting next week." "I can go with you if you want, make it official." Lucas looked at Hope, playing contentedly with a wooden spoon on the floor nearby. The thought of someone claiming her, taking her away, made him feel physically sick. But he also knew he couldn't run from this. If Hope had family who wanted her, who could give her a proper home, he had to at least hear them out. "I'll go," he said. "We'll go." He glanced at Willa, who nodded. "Both of us, we're in this together." The trip to Durango took 2 days by wagon, with Hope between them wrapped in blankets against the cold. It gave Lucas and Willa time to talk, to steel themselves for whatever they might find. They stayed in a hotel that night, in separate rooms for propriety's sake, though Lucas wished more than anything that they didn't have to pretend they were just friends helping a foundling. The meeting was set for mid-morning at the sheriff's office in Durango. The woman who arrived was in her late 40s, well-dressed and carrying herself with the bearing of someone used to comfort. Her name was Martha Whitmore, and she wasted no time on pleasantries. "That's her," she said when she saw Hope in Willa's arms. "That's my granddaughter." Lucas felt his heart drop. "You're certain?" "I'd know her anywhere. She has her mother's eyes, her father's chin." Martha reached out as if to take the baby, then seemed to think better of it. "Where did you find her?" "In the desert east of Rico. Alone, no sign of anyone nearby." Lucas fought to keep his voice steady. "If she's your granddaughter, where's her mother?" Martha's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Dead. My daughter Catherine died 3 days after giving birth. Fever took her fast." The baby's father was a man named Jack Riley, a gambler and a drunk who wanted nothing to do with a child. "He must have taken her from the house while I was making arrangements for Catherine's burial and left her out there to die." "That's monstrous," Willa said quietly. "It is. Jack Riley is a monster, and if I ever see him again, I'll see him hanged." Martha wiped her eyes. "But that doesn't change the fact that this is my granddaughter, my last piece of Catherine. I want her back." The sheriff's office felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Lucas looked at Hope, who was completely unaware of the drama unfolding around her, just playing with the ribbon on Willa's dress. "What are you planning to do with her? How will you care for her?" "I have a home in Durango, means to provide for her. She'll want for nothing." Martha's tone turned defensive. "I have more right to her than a stranger who happened to find her." "That stranger saved her life," Willa said, steel in her voice. "Lucas found her when she was hours from death, brought her to safety, cared for her these past weeks. She knows us, trusts us." "You're the stranger to her. I'm her grandmother. I'm blood." The sheriff held up a hand. "Let's all take a breath. Mrs. Whitmore, you'll need to provide proof of your claim. Birth records, something that establishes this child as your granddaughter. Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Fletcher. I know this is hard, but the law does give preference to blood relations in these matters." Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to fight, but he also knew the truth of it. If Martha Whitmore could prove Hope was her granddaughter, there was no legal ground for him to stand on. He had no claim except the moral one of having saved her, and that wouldn't hold up against family. They left the meeting with nothing resolved, except an agreement that Martha would provide documentation, and they would reconvene in 3 days. Those 3 days were agony. Lucas couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop imagining what it would feel like to hand Hope over and walk away. Willa was equally distraught, holding Hope closer than usual, crying when she thought Lucas couldn't hear. On the second night, lying awake in his hotel room, Lucas made a decision. He got up, dressed, and went to Willa's door. She answered in her nightgown and wrapper, eyes red from crying. "We're not giving her up," Lucas said without preamble. "I don't care what the law says, what blood says. We're the ones who have cared for her, loved her. We're her parents in every way that matters. Lucas, we can't just run, that's kidnapping. Not if we do it right, not if we make it legal." He took her hands. "Marry me, tomorrow, today, right now, if we can find someone to do it. We'll go to the sheriff, tell him we want to adopt Hope, that we're a family and we can provide for her just as well as Martha Whitmore can. It's not a guarantee, but it's a chance." Willa searched his face. "You'd marry me to keep Hope?" "I'd marry you because I love you." "Keeping Hope is just one more reason on a long list." He pulled her close. "Say yes, Willa, let's fight for this." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." They found a minister that night who agreed to perform a ceremony, albeit with raised eyebrows at the hour and the urgency. It was nothing like the wedding either of them might have imagined. Just a quick exchange of vows in a small church with 2 strangers pulled in as witnesses. But when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Lucas kissed his bride, it felt more real and right than anything in his life had before. The next morning, they went to the sheriff as a married couple with a proposal for formal adoption. The sheriff listened, made notes, and said he'd present it to the judge along with Martha Whitmore's claim. It wasn't encouraging, but it wasn't an outright refusal either. The hearing was held on the 4th day. The judge was an older man named Crawford who'd seen every kind of family dispute the West could produce. He listened to Martha Whitmore's claim and her evidence, which consisted of a hastily obtained birth certificate listing Catherine Whitmore as the mother and no father recorded. He listened to Lucas and Willa explain how they'd found Hope, cared for her, and wanted to adopt her as their own. "This is an unusual situation," Judge Crawford said finally. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have the legal high ground here. Blood relation does typically take precedence. But I'm troubled by several aspects of your claim. First, you admit you don't know for certain what happened to the child after your daughter's death. You assume Jack Riley abandoned her, but you have no proof. Second, you made no effort to search for the child, file a missing persons report, or alert authorities. It was only after Sheriff Dalton's inquiries went out that you came forward." "I was grieving my daughter," Martha protested. "I wasn't thinking clearly." "That's understandable, but it doesn't change the facts. This child was dying in the desert, and Mr. Brennan saved her life. He and Mrs. Brennan have cared for her for nearly 2 months now. They've married and are seeking to formally adopt her. That demonstrates commitment and stability." "But she's my granddaughter, maybe." The judge's tone was firm. "And maybe you're a loving grandmother who wants the best for this child. But I've also seen plenty of cases where people claim children for the wrong reasons. Money, property, spite. I need to be certain of your motives, and I need to be certain that placing this child with you is in her best interests." The judge was quiet for a long moment, studying the papers in front of him. Finally, he looked up. "Here's my ruling. I'm granting temporary custody to Lucas and Willa Brennan for a period of 6 months. During that time, Mrs. Whitmore, you're welcome to visit the child. Establish a relationship if you can prove your claim beyond doubt. At the end of 6 months, we'll reconvene and make a final determination based on what's best for the child. If no conclusive evidence of relation is provided, or if it appears that the Brennans are providing superior care, I'll grant them full adoption rights. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Lucas felt Willa grip his hand so tight it hurt, and he squeezed back just as hard. Martha Whitmore looked furious but couldn't seem to find words to protest. The judge banged his gavel and it was done. They left Durango the next morning with Hope legally in their temporary custody, and a piece of paper that said they were married. The trip back to Rico felt different, lighter somehow, despite the uncertainty still hanging over them. They were a family now, official and recognized, and that mattered more than Lucas had realized it would. The first month back was an adjustment. Word spread quickly in a small town like Rico that Lucas and Willa had gotten married, and there were knowing looks and whispered comments about the speed of it. But there were also congratulations, gifts for the baby, and a general acceptance that surprised them both. The boarding house continued to do well, and Lucas picked up additional work helping with repairs around town, building up a small cushion of savings. Hope continued to grow and thrive. At 4 months, she was starting to recognize them specifically, smiling when they came into view, reaching for them when they held her. Those moments were both joyful and terrifying because Lucas knew that in 5 more months it could all be taken away. Martha Whitmore came to visit once, making the trip from Durango with a carpet bag full of expensive clothes and toys for Hope. The visit was awkward and tense, with Martha clearly expecting to be welcomed as family, and instead finding herself treated as a guest at best. Hope cried when Martha tried to hold her, reaching back for Willa with desperate urgency that spoke volumes about who she considered her mother. "She doesn't know me yet," Martha said stiffly. "She will, given time." "Maybe," Willa said, taking Hope back. "Or maybe she knows exactly who her family is." Martha didn't visit again after that, though they received a letter a month later informing them that she'd hired a lawyer to contest the judge's ruling. Lucas read it with a sinking heart, but Willa was defiant. Let her try. "We have 5 more months to prove we're the best home for Hope. We'll use every day." They did. Lucas built a proper cradle for Hope, carved with designs of horses and mountains. Willa sewed clothes by hand, each stitch an act of love. They took Hope to church on Sundays, introduced her to the town as their daughter, created a history and a community around her that said this was where she belonged. In December, when Hope was 6 months old and the Colorado winter had settled in hard, a man came to town asking questions. He was rail, thin, and nervous, with the smell of whiskey on him even at midday. His name was Jack Riley, and he claimed to be Hope's father. Sheriff Dalton brought him to the boarding house with a grim expression. "He says he's here to check on the baby, make sure she's all right." "Thought you should know." Lucas met Riley at the door, blocking it with his body. "You're the one who left her in the desert to die." "That was a mistake, a moment of grief and poor judgment," Riley said, the words coming out practiced like he'd rehearsed them. "I loved Catherine, and when she died, I wasn't thinking straight. But I'm sober now, and I want to make amends. I want to be part of my daughter's life." "No." Lucas didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "You abandoned her. You left her to die. You don't get to just come back and pretend that didn't happen. I'm her father. I have rights. You gave up any rights when you left her alone in the dust." Lucas took a step forward and Riley retreated. "If you try to claim her, I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. I'll testify in court, bring witnesses, do whatever it takes to make sure you never get near her. You understand me?" Riley looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Lucas's expression stopped him. "I just wanted to see her, make sure she's all right. She's perfect, no thanks to you. And she's going to stay that way, which means you staying far away from her." Lucas paused. "If you actually care about her well-being, you'll leave and never come back. Let her grow up with people who love her, who would never abandon her." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Then Riley nodded slowly and turned away, shoulders hunched against the cold. Lucas watched him walk down the street and out of sight, then went back inside where Willa was waiting with Hope in her arms. "Is he gone?" she asked. "He's gone, and I don't think he'll be back." Lucas took Hope from her, holding his daughter close. "But we need to tell the judge about this. It might help our case." They wrote to Judge Crawford that evening, detailing Riley's visit and his admission of abandonment. The response came back 2 weeks later. The judge was moving up their final hearing to February, stating that Riley's appearance and subsequent departure suggested he had no real interest in parenting, and that continuing the uncertainty wasn't in the child's best interests. The second hearing was held on a cold February morning in Durango. Martha Whitmore was there with her lawyer, arguing that her granddaughter should be with blood family. But Lucas and Willa came with letters from half the town of Rico, testifying to their character and their devotion to Hope. They came with Dr. Mathers, who explained in medical terms how close Hope had been to death when Lucas found her. They came with Sheriff Dalton, who described Riley's visit and his own opinion that the Brennans were fit parents. Most importantly, they came with Hope herself, now 8 months old and clearly thriving. She laughed and played during the hearing, completely comfortable with Lucas and Willa. When Martha tried to approach her, Hope hid her face in Willa's shoulder and wouldn't look at the older woman. Judge Crawford took less time to deliberate than before. This court finds that Hope Brennan, as she has been known since being found, is best served by remaining with Lucas and Willa Brennan, who have proven themselves devoted and capable parents. Martha Whitmore's claim as grandmother is noted, but not sufficient to overcome the clear bond this child has with her adoptive parents. Jack Riley's abandonment of the child eliminates any parental rights he might have claimed. Therefore, I am granting full and permanent adoption to Lucas and Willa Brennan. This child is legally and permanently theirs. The gavel came down, and Lucas felt tears on his face that he didn't bother to hide. Willa was crying too, holding Hope tight, and Hope was patting her mother's face with confused concern that made them both laugh through the tears. Martha Whitmore left the courtroom without a word, her lawyer trailing behind. Lucas felt a moment of sympathy for her, for the loss she'd suffered, but it was buried under the overwhelming relief and joy of knowing Hope was truly theirs. They celebrated that night at the hotel, ordering room service and toasting with apple cider since they had Hope with them. It felt like the start of something, like they'd crossed a threshold into a future that was finally secure. The trip back to Rico took 3 days because they weren't in a hurry anymore, stopping to let Hope play when she got fussy, camping under the stars one night because they could. Lucas held his family close and looked up at the vast Colorado sky and felt more grateful than he'd ever been for a crying sound he could have ignored, for a decision to stop and help, for a woman who'd opened her door and her heart to a stranger and a foundling. Spring came to Rico with wildflowers in the mountains and renewed energy in the town. The boarding house thrived as miners and travelers came through, and Lucas took on more work building and repairing structures around town. Hope took her first steps in May, wobbling across the kitchen floor into Willa's waiting arms while Lucas watched with foolish pride. They talked about the future now in concrete terms, about eventually buying land of their own, maybe building a bigger house, about whether Hope would want brothers or sisters, and if they wanted to take that risk given Willa's age and the danger of childbirth in this time and place. About growing old together in this little mining town that had become home. One evening in June, after Hope was asleep, and they were sitting on the porch as had become their habit, Willa turned to Lucas with a particular expression he'd learned meant she had something important to say. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. "I saw a doctor. Mathers today to be sure, but I already knew. I'm about 3 months along." Lucas felt his heart stutter. "Are you all right? Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. Mathers says I'm healthy and the pregnancy seems to be progressing normally." She took his hand. "I know we talked about this being risky, but I want this baby, Lucas. I want Hope to have a brother or sister. I want to have your child." "I want that too." He pulled her close, careful of her belly, even though she wasn't showing yet. "I want everything with you, every possible piece of life we can have together." The pregnancy was harder on Willa than either of them expected. She was sick most mornings and tired all the time, struggling to keep up with the demands of running the boarding house and caring for an increasingly mobile toddler. Lucas took on more of both, hiring a local girl to help with cleaning and cooking, insisting Willa rest as much as possible. Hope seemed to sense something was different, becoming extra clingy with Willa, wanting to be held constantly. It was exhausting for everyone, but also sweet in its own way, this small family adjusting to make room for one more. The baby came in January, during a snowstorm that shut down most of the town. Dr. Mathers almost didn't make it through the drifts, arriving just minutes before Willa went into hard labor. Lucas stayed with her throughout, holding her hand and talking her through it, while Hope slept in the next room unaware that her world was changing. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him Thomas, after Willa's first husband, because she said she wanted to honor the man who'd been kind to her, even if their time had been short. Lucas held his son and felt a different kind of love than what he felt for Hope, not stronger but different, and marveled at how much capacity the heart had for this kind of feeling. Hope was fascinated by her baby brother, wanting to touch him constantly, bringing him toys and patting his head with careful gentleness. She was 2 years old now, talking in short sentences and getting into everything, and the addition of Thomas made the house feel chaotic and alive in the best possible way. The years that followed were good ones, busy and sometimes challenging but fundamentally happy in a way Lucas had never expected to find. They eventually did buy land, a few acres outside town where they built a small ranch. Lucas raised horses, good sturdy animals bred for mountain work, and found he had a talent for it. Willa kept the boarding house for a few more years before selling it to focus on the ranch and the children. Hope grew into a bright, curious girl who loved the outdoors and had a way with the horses that reminded Lucas of himself at that age. Thomas was quieter, more studious, interested in books and numbers in a way neither of his parents quite understood but encouraged anyway. When Hope was 6 and Thomas was 4, Willa got pregnant again, surprising them all. That baby was another girl they named Catherine, after Willa's mother and the woman who'd given birth to Hope, a way of honoring all the paths that had led to their family. There were hard times too. A winter when Thomas got sick with pneumonia, and they thought they might lose him, sitting up for nights in a row until the fever finally broke. A drought that killed half their herd and forced Lucas to take extra work in town to make ends meet. The usual struggles of raising children and running a ranch and maintaining a marriage through all of it. But the good far outweighed the bad. Sunday dinners with the whole family around the table, Hope and Thomas arguing while Catherine banged her spoon and demanded attention. Summer evenings when Lucas would teach the children to ride, patient and careful, while Willa watched from the porch. Winter nights huddled together by the fire, reading aloud from whatever books they could get their hands on, building a world of words to go with the world of mountains and sky surrounding them. On Hope's 18th birthday, Lucas told her the whole story of how she'd come into their lives. She'd known she was adopted, but they'd kept the details vague, not wanting to burden her with the knowledge of how close she'd come to dying. But she was an adult now, had a right to know her history. She cried when he told her about finding her in the desert, about the question he'd asked that had changed everything. "Who would abandon you?" she repeated. "That's what you said." "That's what I said, because I couldn't understand it then and I still can't now. But I'm grateful every day that someone did, because it brought you to us." Hope hugged him tight. "I'm grateful too, for you and Mama and this whole life. I wouldn't trade it for anything." Lucas and Willa watched their children grow and leave home one by one. Hope married a rancher from Telluride and started her own family. Thomas went to Denver for college and became a teacher. Catherine, their surprise baby, turned out to be the one who loved the ranch most, taking over its management as Lucas and Willa got older. They grew old together on that land, watching grandchildren play in the same dirt where Hope had taken her first steps, teaching new generations the same lessons about horses and responsibility and treating people with kindness. Willa's hair went white and Lucas's joints ached in the cold, but they still sat on the porch most evenings, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. On their 30th anniversary, Lucas took Willa back to the spot where he'd found Hope. It was the first time either of them had returned there, and they stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the dusty ground that had nearly been a grave. "I think about that day a lot," Lucas said finally. "How easily I could have missed hearing her, could have ridden past, could have decided it wasn't my problem. But you didn't. You stopped and you saved her and you changed all our lives." Willa leaned against him. "That's who you are, Lucas. Someone who stops, someone who helps, someone who loves fiercely and completely. I'm so lucky I got to build a life with you. I'm the lucky one." He kissed her temple. "You took in a drifter and a foundling and turned us into a family. You gave me everything I didn't know I needed." They stood there as the sun set over the mountains, two people who'd found each other through chance and choice, through crisis and care. The desert was quiet around them, patient and eternal, keeping its secrets. Whatever had brought baby Hope to this place, whatever circumstances had led to her abandonment, they would never fully know. But it had led to this, to family and love and a life fully lived, and that was enough. When they died, Lucas first, and then Willa 3 years later, they were buried on the ranch under a cottonwood tree Lucas had planted the year they'd bought the land. Their children and grandchildren gathered to remember them, telling stories of kindness and strength, and a love that had started with a desperate question in the desert and had grown into something that touched everyone it reached. The grave markers were simple, just their names and dates. But someone, probably Hope though she never admitted it, added a line beneath Willa's name that captured everything. "Who stopped to help and stayed forever." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, and the story of Lucas and Willa and the baby found in the dust became part of family legend, told and retold until the details blurred but the heart of it remained clear. Love could start anywhere, even in the hardest places. Family wasn't just blood but choice and commitment and showing up day after day. And sometimes the question that changed everything was as simple as asking who would abandon someone, and then deciding you never would. Years turned into decades, and the Wild West of Lucas and Willa's time became history. The rough mining town of Rico transforming into something more settled and permanent. But the land remained, and the family remained, and the legacy of two people who'd chosen each other and a foundling baby and had built something beautiful out of near tragedy remained. Hope lived to be 93, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all knew the story of her beginning. She never forgot what Lucas had told her, that he'd looked at her in the dust and couldn't understand how anyone could abandon her. That knowledge had shaped her life, made her someone who never walked past someone in need, who always stopped to help, who paid forward the kindness that had saved her. Thomas became a renowned educator who started schools in rural Colorado, bringing learning to places that had never had it before. He married late, to a woman named Grace who shared his passion for teaching, and they had 4 children who all went into service professions of their own. Catherine ran the ranch until she was 80, then passed it to her daughter who passed it to hers. The Brennan Ranch became known throughout the region for quality horses and quality people, for being a place where you could get a fair deal and a helping hand if you needed it. The boarding house that Willa had run became a historical landmark, preserved as an example of frontier life, and tours would mention the widow who'd taken in a drifter and a foundling, and had started a dynasty of kindness. But perhaps the greatest legacy was simply this: a family that existed at all. Hope could have died in the desert, unmarked and unmourned. Lucas could have ridden past, too focused on his own troubles to hear a baby crying. Willa could have turned them away, unwilling to take on the burden of someone else's crisis. Any one of those things could have happened, and the world would have been poorer for it in ways both large and small. Instead, a baby lived. A drifter found a home. A widow found love again. 3 people became a family, and that family became many, and all of it traced back to a single moment of choice in the high desert of Colorado in the summer of 1882. On the ranch, in a frame on the wall of the house that replaced the original one Lucas built, hung a photograph taken around 1900. It showed Lucas and Willa, older but still vital, flanked by their 3 children and a growing crowd of grandchildren. Everyone in the photo was smiling, and if you looked closely at Lucas's hand where it rested on Hope's shoulder, you could see the protective, proud grip of a father who'd chosen his daughter and never regretted it for a single moment. Beside the photograph was a small placard with words attributed to Lucas, something he'd said late in life when asked about finding hope. "The desert taught me that day that miracles look like need, and angels look like ordinary people who decide to care. I was no angel, just a man who heard crying and couldn't ride away. But that decision, that moment of stopping, gave me everything that mattered. It gave me family. It gave me purpose. It gave me love. All because I asked who would abandon a baby and then decided I would be the one who never did." Those words became something of a family motto, passed down through generations, a reminder that the most important legacies started with simple choices to help, to care, to love even when it was inconvenient or difficult or scary. That family wasn't defined by blood alone, but by showing up, day after day, and choosing each other over and over again. The story of the baby found alone in the dust, and the cowboy who asked who would abandon her, became more than just family history. It became parable, legend, a story told to illustrate what was possible when people chose compassion over convenience. It was told at weddings to remind couples that love was both finding and keeping. It was told at funerals to honor those who'd chosen family over ease. It was told to children to teach them that everyone deserved to be chosen, to be wanted, to be loved. And somewhere in Colorado, on land that had been wild and was now tamed, under mountains that had watched it all and would watch long after, the legacy continued. New babies were born into the Brennan family, each one welcomed with the knowledge that they were chosen, wanted, part of something that had started with an act of salvation in the desert and had grown into something vast and beautiful. The boarding house in Rico eventually became a museum, lovingly preserved with period furnishings and historical documents. Among the displays was a small basket, carefully conserved, with a placard explaining that this had been baby Hope's first bed after being rescued from the desert. Visitors would stop and look at the simple woven basket and marvel at how something so ordinary had been part of something so extraordinary. In the museum's guest book, people wrote messages inspired by the story. Reminds me to pay attention, to listen for those who need help. Made me think about my own family, how we're all just choosing each other every day. Beautiful example of what love looks like in action. The comments went on for pages, hundreds of visitors touched by a story that was both unique and universal. Because at its heart, the story of Lucas and Willa and Hope wasn't really about the Old West or frontier hardship or dramatic rescues, though it contained all those things. It was about the fundamental human capacity for love, for seeing someone in need and choosing to help, for building family out of circumstance and intention. It was about asking who would abandon you, and then answering, not me, never me. That question and its answer echoed through time, relevant in every era, speaking to the eternal truth that people needed each other, that family was what you made it, that love was always, always a choice. You chose to stop when you could have ridden past. You chose to take in a stranger when you could have turned him away. You chose to build a life together when it would have been easier to keep your distance. You chose, every day, to show up and care and love, and those choices mattered. They mattered in the moment, saving a life or starting a romance. They mattered over years, building a family and a legacy. They mattered across generations, creating ripples that touched people who never met the original choosers but benefited from their choices nonetheless. The desert where Hope had been found remained largely unchanged, still harsh and beautiful and indifferent. But it was marked now, informally but permanently, as a place where something important had happened. Locals would bring visitors to the spot, pointing out the rocks where Lucas had found the baby, telling the story with varying degrees of accuracy, but always with the same core truth. This was where a life was saved and a family began. Some people left small tokens there, flowers or stones or coins, turning it into an impromptu shrine to second chances and choosing to care. The tokens would blow away or get buried in the dust, but new ones always appeared, evidence that the story still resonated, still mattered, still spoke to something deep in people's hearts about what it meant to be human and humane. Lucas and Willa never knew, couldn't have known, the full extent of what they'd started that day in the desert. They lived their lives focused on the immediate, on the children who needed raising and the ranch that needed running and the daily work of loving each other through good times and hard. They didn't think of themselves as remarkable, would have been embarrassed by being called heroes or pioneers of compassion. They were just people doing their best with what life handed them. But that was the point, really. Heroes weren't special creatures set apart from regular people. They were regular people who made the choice to help when it would have been easier not to. Who took on burdens that weren't theirs because someone needed to. Who loved fiercely and completely even when it was risky or difficult or complicated. Every person who heard the story of Lucas and Willa and Hope took something different from it. Some heard a romance about two damaged people finding each other and healing together. Some heard an adoption story about making family beyond biology. Some heard a tale of the Old West, of hardship and survival and the particular challenges of that time and place. Some heard a meditation on providence, on the mysterious ways circumstances align to bring people together. All of those interpretations were valid, because the story was large enough to contain them all. But underneath, everything else was the simplest, most powerful truth. Love saved lives. Not romantic love alone, though Lucas and Willa's love was real and deep and lasting. But the broader love that made you stop for a crying baby, that made you open your door to a stranger in need, that made you fight for a child who had no one else. That love, active and choosing and determined, was what transformed the world one person, one family, one decision at a time. The Brennan family continued to grow and spread, branches of the family tree reaching into different states and different professions, but always with that core story at the root. They knew where they'd come from, knew the chance and choice that had started it all, and it shaped how they moved through the world. They were teachers and ranchers, doctors and shopkeepers, artists and engineers, but whatever they did it with the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. They were the descendants of people who had chosen each other, who had built family out of love rather than obligation, and that heritage carried weight and meaning. When great-great-grandchildren of Hope married and started families of their own, they told their children about the baby found in the dust and the cowboy who couldn't walk away. The details got fuzzy over time, names forgotten and dates mixed up, but the heart of the story remained clear and powerful. Someone needed help. Someone helped. Love followed. Family followed. A whole world of possibility followed from that single choice to stop and care. And that was how legacies really worked, not through grand gestures or famous deeds, but through small choices that compounded over time, through love that multiplied across generations, through stories that taught values and shaped worldviews long after the original storytellers were gone. Lucas and Willa and Hope were gone. Their physical bodies returned to the earth of Colorado they'd loved. But they weren't really gone at all. They lived in every descendant who chose compassion over convenience, in every person who heard their story and decided to be someone who stopped and helped, in every family that understood that love was both a feeling and an action, both gift and choice. The ranch still stood, updated and modernized but recognizably the same. The land still produced good horses. The family still gathered there for holidays and celebrations, multiple generations filling the house with noise and life and love. And if you sat quietly on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the mountains, you could almost feel them there. Lucas and Willa, still choosing each other, still choosing their children, still living the legacy they'd created when a cowboy heard crying in the desert and asked a question that changed everything. Who would abandon you? The question rang through the years, unanswerable and rhetorical and profound. Who would abandon a baby, a person in need, a chance to make a difference? The answer was that some people would, people acting out of fear or desperation or cruelty. But the better question, the one that mattered more, was who would stop and help? And the answer to that, exemplified by Lucas and Willa, and everyone who followed their example, was people who chose love over fear, who saw need and responded, who understood that family was built through showing up and caring and never, ever abandoning those who depended on them. That was the lesson, the legacy, the love story that started in the dust of Colorado and grew into something that touched countless lives. It wasn't about perfection or being special. It was about making the choice to care, over and over again, until caring became who you were and love became your legacy. And in the end, that was everything.